Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're setting the stakes for a truly extraordinary story of leadership set against the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Pacific War on the island of Saipan. And at the absolute center of this chaos is a guy who completely defies your typical action hero stereotype. We're talking about a former store clerk from Troy, New York. He'd been in uniform for 27 years, working his way up from a teenage private to a 44-year-old battalion commander. And over the course of 18 agonizing days, Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien is going to demonstrate a brand of leadership that's honestly almost impossible to comprehend.
So you've got to wonder, how does that happen? Well, to answer that, we have to start by dropping right into the sheer absolute chaos of June 20th, 1944. Just picture this terrifying scenario for a second. You have blinded American Sherman tanks, and their crews are completely disoriented by the brutal tropical heat, choking coral dust, and heavy enemy fire. They've sealed their hatches shut. Because they literally can't see, they are accidentally pumping 75mm high-explosive shells directly into their own infantrymen. It is pure pandemonium. And in that terrifying moment of friendly fire, one commander decides to step right out from cover and actually do something about it. And that moment perfectly sets up our path today. We're going to map out this brutal 18-day escalation for the 105th Infantry on Saipan. We'll start with that June 20th tank crisis, move on to the massive stall at Obi's Ridge on June 28th, and finally we'll hit the devastating climax, the final Banzai charge on July 7th. So, let's look at the reality of this crisis on Saipan. This island was a nightmare. It was heavily fortified by 32,000 Japanese defenders, all dug into concrete bunkers and natural cave systems. The American advance was just agonizingly slow. We are literally talking about measuring progress in yards per hour and lives per day. And in that kind of environment, the contrast between textbook military command and O'Brien's reality is pretty jarring. Standard procedure says a battalion commander of his rank should be tucked safely in a rear command post, sending out runners, right? But during that tank crisis we just talked about, O'Brien didn't have a radio, so he drew his Colt 45, left his cover, and sprinted straight through Japanese machine gun fire toward those blinded tanks. He physically hammered on the steel turret with the butt of his pistol until the crew opened the hatch, and then he stood totally exposed on the hull just to direct their fire. The guy absolutely refused to lead from safety. Moving ahead a bit, the situation only gets more intense as we reach Obi's Ridge. As the daily casualties kept mounting, we hit June 28th. The entire battalion was completely stopped in its tracks by a heavily fortified position the men later called Obi's Ridge. The Japanese had loaded it up with machine guns and a heavy 77mm field gun. Frontal assaults, they were just causing devastating losses. So O'Brien decides the solution is a double envelopment maneuver. Sounds simple enough on paper, right? But to even start step one, a critical platoon was pinned down on the far side of 1,200 yards of dense jungle canopy, an area entirely controlled by Japanese snipers. Runners had already been killed just trying to cross it. So what does O'Brien do? He crosses the whole thing alone, a 44-year-old commander moving completely solo for over an hour through an absolute shooting gallery just to reach his trapped men so he could lead the assault. And against all odds, the success of that seemingly impossible crossing came down to just 5 men. Once he actually reached the platoon, O'Brien realized the Japanese defenses were entirely facing forward. So he grabs just 4 other guys, and they climb up this incredibly steep, narrow coral ravine. They're going single file where one single enemy grenade would have wiped the whole group out. But they made it. They attacked the Japanese from the completely unexposed rear. 5 men ended up capturing 5 heavy machine guns and the 77mm field gun that had stalled the entire battalion. But as incredible as that was, nothing could prepare them for the final Banzai charge. Let's fast forward to the evening of July 6th, on the flat, open ground of the Tanapag Plain. Weeks of grinding, brutal attrition had backed the remaining, desperate Japanese forces into a tight corner on the northern coastline. They're starving, they're completely out of medical supplies, and their backs are literally against the sea. Now, to understand what happens next, we need to be really clear on this concept. A Banzai charge wasn't a tactical move to take ground. It was an all-out attack aimed purely at inflicting maximum casualties before inevitable death. The 2 senior Japanese commanders on Saipan, Saito and Nagamo, actually committed suicide in their caves, but right before they did, they issued a terrifying final order. Every surviving soldier, sailor, and even armed civilian was to launch everything they had at the American lines before dawn. And I really want to emphasize the sheer, terrifying scale of what hit the Americans at 04:45 on July 7th. We are talking about between 3,000 and 5,000 attackers surging out of the jungle at once.
This wasn't standard combat. It was a continuous, roaring human wave that just absorbed devastating losses and kept moving forward. They found a vulnerable seam in the American defense, a tiny gap between two battalions, and they just poured straight through it. It instantly fractured the organized American defense into dozens of isolated, chaotic, pitch-black fights.
And this brings us directly to O'Brien's ultimate test.
The perimeter is completely collapsed. The command structure is shattered. The battle has devolved into this vicious hand-to-hand nightmare in the dark where you can barely tell friend from foe. Men were terrified, completely on the verge of breaking. And instead of taking cover, O'Brien does the unthinkable. He walks upright, right through the shattered lines in the dark. He's got a pistol in each hand, stepping over the fallen, firing point-blank into the surging Japanese wave. It was just his physical presence and his voice cutting through all the gunfire and the screaming, yelling, "Don't give them a damned inch," that gave his completely terrified men the anchor they needed to hold the line. His final act of sacrifice is honestly almost unbelievable. O'Brien takes a bullet to the shoulder, but he just waves off the medic trying to bandage him. He keeps firing until both of his pistols are completely empty. With the American positions totally overrun, he spots a Jeep with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the back. It has no armor, no sandbags. He is completely exposed from the chest up. But he climbs right onto that Jeep and turns that heavy weapon directly onto the wave of attackers. His muzzle flashes basically lighting up the pre-dawn darkness. This brutal, unrelenting battle raged for 15 straight hours across the plain. But O'Brien's solo stand at that machine gun, it bought the absolutely critical minutes his men needed. Because he was drawing all the enemy's focus and fire, the surviving Americans behind him, the guys who had been forced out of their foxholes, actually had the time to fall back, regroup, and form a vital second defensive line. For those crucial minutes, he was the literal physical barrier between the Japanese flood and his retreating soldiers. When the sun finally rose, and the charge lost its momentum under heavy artillery and naval gunfire, the terrifying aftermath became clear. Exactly 4,311 Japanese soldiers lay dead across that plain. It officially went down as the deadliest Banzai attack of the entire Pacific War. But the Americans paid a devastating, heartbreaking price. In just 15 hours of fighting, the 105th Infantry Regiment took over 900 casualties. They lost over 80% of 2 entire battalions. They found O'Brien among the fallen, his body surrounded by roughly 30 enemy soldiers he had stopped before his completely exposed position was finally overwhelmed. This leads us to the incredible, lingering legacy of that terrible morning. You know, it is incredibly rare for 3 men from a single regiment in a single battle on a single day to earn the Medal of Honor. But that's what happened here. We have O'Brien, the commander at the Jeep. Then there's Private Thomas Baker. He was badly wounded and asked his buddies to just prop him against a tree with a loaded pistol. They found him later with a pistol completely empty and 8 enemies dead at his feet. And then we have Captain Benjamin Solomon, the regimental dentist of all people, who took over a machine gun to cover the evacuation of his wounded patients, fighting to the very end to protect them. But here's a truly shocking fact. While O'Brien and Baker received their medals shortly after the war, Captain Solomon's was delayed for an astounding 56 years. The Army initially ruled that because he was a medical officer, firing a heavy machine gun violated the Geneva Convention, even though he was literally doing it to protect helpless patients. It wasn't until 2002 that the United States government finally corrected the record and posthumously awarded him his rightful Medal of Honor. When you summarize William O'Brien's legacy, what makes his Medal of Honor citation so incredibly rare is that it wasn't for a single brief moment of extreme courage. It explicitly covers 18 continuous days of action, from hitting the tanks to climbing the ridge, right up to that final stand at the Jeep. This wasn't just a flash of recklessness. The man had a wife and a young son waiting for him back home. Instead, it was a sustained, deliberate pattern. Every single time his men were in danger, he made the conscious choice to step forward, planting himself squarely between his soldiers and the fire trying to kill them. And that's exactly why I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. William O'Brien gave every round, every breath, and literally every last second he had, just so the men behind him could survive to see another day. When you look at that kind of uncompromising devotion, it really forces you to ask yourself, if the moment ever truly demanded it, what would you be willing to sacrifice for the people standing behind you? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.